Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, Marty Haught, Director of Open Source at Ruby Central, joins us. Marty joins us from Longmont, Colorado, in the United States. Marty Haught, we're so glad to have you join us at Maintainable. Welcome.
Thanks, Robbie. It's great to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing that I've experienced is the lack of tests really makes it difficult. Good tests are everything because you can understand sort of the intent and sort of maybe original behavior of a system and also sort of like the thinking that people put behind what they're building. And of course, if you're going to make changes, then you've got tests so you can make changes and know if you worked or if it broke something that you didn't expect. So yeah, I think good tests is definitely up there. And I think the other one is really readability, because I remember early in my career, the sort of joke around a Perl was like you'd write it, but then 6 months later, you wouldn't be able to understand what you actually created and try to make sense of that. So I think the readability is really important because, your future self or others that are going to come and take care of the software later on, them being able to understand it is so crucial. Those are my two top ones.
I like that. And, actually you brought up Perl, and I used to work with Perl back in the day as well at a previous job that I had. And I'm curious if you maybe reflect on that. Was there any sort of sense of pride that you felt back then that you're like, oh, wow, like I can do all this clever stuff in Perl. It was a little obscure at times, but then when you go back, you're like, how does this work again? Did you care about readability back then, like in the same way that you might now? Or was it it was just a little bit more difficult, but that was the cost of getting to work with a nice scripting language like Perl?
I certainly did not care as much. And I just didn't know as much. Newer to the industry. I mean, Perl was one of the first languages I worked with. I didn't work with it a ton. I actually worked more with PL/SQL, which is an Oracle scripting language, I guess, that, for interacting with the database. That was at Digital River in the 90s. And so I didn't really know any better. And it wasn't until later on that I just assumed computer programming is supposed to be hard. So it shouldn't be too easy, right? It shouldn't be geared towards your productivity. It's about the machine or whatever, right? And so I don't think actually until I encountered Ruby that changed my thinking of oh, this is for me to express my intent of how I'm building software. And it doesn't have to be obtuse. It doesn't have to be, I need to spend a few minutes grokking a line of software versus oh, I read it, skim it. Oh, I think I understand what's happening here. I understand the intent of what's happening here. So it was definitely not until later on, much further in my career, where I appreciated readability versus being clever or the least number of characters to accomplish the action.
Do you feel because I have a very similar progression there of them, getting introduced to Ruby, I guess it was a little over 20 years ago now. And yeah, I think, at that moment, I was like, oh, wow, I can comprehend what this is. It's written English quite a bit. It just felt friendlier in a way. And I'm like, I feel like it unlocked something in my brain that I could focus on other things while I was doing my programming tasks or working on a client project, what have you. And do you feel like that's true for people in other programming languages, or is that something you think is kind of a little bit unique to what we were able to kind of transition? And so do you get a sense that in other communities, readability is as much of an important thing as we seem to think it is because it's just kind of built into the language?
I don't know if it's quite to the level in Ruby in other language ecosystems. I think it definitely has improved. I certainly have seen in other, when we were doing some Elixir work, it was a while ago, TypeScript, it did seem like it was more readable. There was more care in terms of naming, in terms of, especially when you're thinking about what is the domain of a service, what is it trying to accomplish, that the functions or methods that you're writing sort of convey that meaning. So I do think that certainly better than software in the 90s was. You'd have these variable names that were just letters and were pretty much trying to save space or something. And certainly I remember in the 90s working with computers, this is before I started programming, that there was very much concern around sort of the memory available to your software to run. Like that was a very real constraint that systems had back then. And that's no longer the concern. So like we can write these higher level languages that are really optimized for humans, that we can have multiple layers that translate that down to get closer and closer to the machine, where definitely in the 90s that you weren't that far away from that.
That's true. What's your take on the metaphor technical debt? Do you use it in your day-to-day work, or how has your take on it evolved maybe over the years?
It's interesting. I still use it some, and I think it's definitely overloaded as a term. I would say, just for some context of my progression as a programmer, I would say it's around 2004 that I really took the next step up as a programmer and as a systems designer when I discovered test-driven development. I discovered Martin Fowler's refactoring. I discovered extreme programming and Kent Beck's work. And so I think it was around then that I started thinking differently about software. So, and certainly technical debt was a term that was used very heavily in the aughts and so forth. I think it's still a very important concept to think about. And really, I think a better term possibly could be drift. I mean, like if we think about technical debt, the classic example from my memory is that like you're taking shortcuts. So you're incurring debt to go faster. And there's this idea that you would pay off the debt by going back and revisiting those shortcuts. And I think that's a pretty good description for technical debt. But I think a lot of people use technical debt in a broader sense that maybe better is represented by drift. And drift is the idea that when you design a system, you have a certain purpose. There's like the business logic, there's the stories that you're implementing and the functionality you're trying to create. And that's very clear. But of course, nothing is static. Things are constantly changing. We grow and evolve our systems based on feedback, whether that's feedback from other programmers, from the system itself, from customers, from the business saying, oh, we're going to go and do this now, or this quite isn't getting the return we want, so we're going to try it and pivot to this new thing. Well, the thing is that you've just changed the purpose of that system and the design has changed. So how much that the software stays lockstep with the new intent of the software and how it's supposed to be doing, probably not. And so you have this cruft that stays behind that still works, but probably isn't as elegant of a design. And if you were starting fresh, you might approach it differently. And over time, it builds up to where that's massive.
One of the toughest parts of working with a team is staying organized, especially when you're all sharing the same inbox. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Jelly is the best way for a team to share an email inbox. Whether it's for customer support, community organizing, or even managing banned emails, Jelly helps your team work together better without the hefty price tag of other tools. With Jelly, your team can collaborate on conversations with customers, users, and community members all in one place. No more stepping on toes or sending double replies. The I got this feature makes it clear who's taking the lead. And private inline comments and @ mentions let the whole team contribute when necessary. You can even start conversations directly in Jelly, so everyone stays in the loop from the start. And here's the best part. Jelly's affordable plans are priced per team, not per seat. That means no extra cost as your team grows. Jelly gives you everything you need in a shared inbox. Without the clutter, you don't. Find out more at letsjelly.com and use the code maintainable for 20% off your first year. That's letsjelly.com, letsjelly.com. Try Jelly today, the shared inbox your team deserves. All right, let's get back to the show. That's true. I like that term drift, and I've heard some people kind of reference that here and there, and trying to find other ways to describe the differences between that, because I feel like there's always this interesting thing where maybe I notice it a little less now that I work more fully remote, but just working with engineers and seeing how they their career evolves, I've always felt like there's a point where people kind of build enough confidence about their skill set that they can start going, the way this thing, because also my team tends to work on existing software that other teams had worked on. So we're inheriting a lot of things. And so when these projects come to us, I'm going to be like, well, let's list out all the technical debt. And I'm like, well, is an overdue upgrade technical debt? Or is it just, we can call it that, I guess, but it's just like that's that's like overdue maintenance maybe? And then like, how do you separate all this stuff to help prioritize this in one bucket? And like, it's probably several different categories of different type of work. Or there's also a thing where seeing developers be like, well, someone else wrote it in a pattern that I wouldn't today. Is that technical debt, or is it just code that you disagree with? And I don't, it's just like, do we have to change it very often? When do we approach this? And we'll dig into a little bit of this a little bit later as well. But it's just always kind of curious about how people frame that right now. And I'm also hoping to interview Ward Cunningham in the near future about this. I'm spending time thinking about technical debt as well. I'm like, let's talk to the person that came up with this whole concept, and he might regret it at this point. But and then I had to answer a lot of questions about it. One of the things I wanted to kind of definitely speak with you about was your role with Ruby Central and RubyGems, because it's such a critical part of the Ruby community, which we're both part of, and not all of our listeners are part of the Ruby community. But it's where, for those, if you're not sure, RubyGems is basically where it's our package management system and repository. So all of the third party or the libraries that we tend to use, like Rails is a library that's hosted on RubyGems. So and all the different libraries that are part of Rails come with that. So given that, what does your work as a steward of this type of tool infrastructure involve? And what sort of challenges do you face in keep it running smoothly?
The role is new in terms of I just started in August. I've known the team for quite some time, but I've never actually worked that closely with them. I've been part of Ruby Central. Ruby Central is the nonprofit that oversees RubyGems. It also runs RubyConf and RailsConf. And so and Bundler and RubyGems are essentially together, so they're united, and the team is one team that oversees that. And RubyGems is pretty old in terms of technology. It was invented in 2004. It actually came out of a hack night at RubyConf in 2003.
Is that Bundler as well?
So I'm told. I was not around at that point. But so it's been with us a long time. The software is pretty solid. Like, it's been rock solid for many years. The systems have been rock solid. I think actually we haven't had a major outage since 2013, which is really pretty impressive. So when I came on board, this team was already functioning well. It knew how to exist. And what's interesting about this is a team of volunteers. Largely, Andre Arco put together Ruby Together to help sort of fund the development and maintenance of RubyGems, because it's open source. Like, whose job is it to maintain that and pay for it? And the answer, well, Ruby Central has paid for RubyGems, the hosting of it, since the beginning, has covered that. And we relied on basically OSS contributors, volunteers, to maintain it. It was built, Jim Wyrick and Chad Fowler and some others put together back in the day, just because we need this. This is a thing that our community needs. We need an easy way to share code, and grew from there. And there have been some different companies like Engine Yard that have really funded the development of it by having someone on staff do that work. But those days long past. So now what's that sustainability model of how do you keep this free system going? How do you fund that? And so part of my job is to think about, how do we make this sustainable? How do we improve security? And it's been so stepping back, Ruby Together was a separate nonprofit entity that oversaw the maintenance, and Ruby Central just handled the hosting, but we didn't do any of the maintenance. Ruby Together folks did that. Well, in 2022, Ruby Together merged with Ruby Central. So we brought both the maintenance side as well as the hosting side together. And it took a couple years essentially to figure out how we wanted to function in this new entity. And during that time, we also started collecting money or sort of donations from certain companies that wanted to advance security. Because if you think about it, package repositories are absolutely critical. Like, all your dependencies are being built from them. And so if there was security issues, vulnerabilities, malware, or exploits happening at that layer, everyone using that software is at risk. And of course, you just trust that it's going to be fine. Like, gem install and bundle install, and it all just comes in, you're great, right? Well, what if you're not? What if you have a gem somewhere in your dependency graph that's been compromised? So there's a lot of risk. And so companies recognized this and approached us and said, hey, can we give you some money to improve security? And specifically, AWS actually funded Samuel Giddens to work as a security engineer in residence this last year. And we also just got another round of funding for Sam and myself to continue in a full-time capacity to work on this. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of work we could do. And it's not possible. It wouldn't be possible to do this with just volunteer hours. There's no way. The work is too deep. There's too much to do to expect someone to do that nights and weekends. And so my role really is, how do you build a sustainable program that not only brings in sufficient funding, but also manages the team, sets direction, makes sure we're working on the right things, and also keeps the systems up and running.
The timing of when we're actually recording this, mid-December, and this episode will come out in the future. But I saw that, did you work with Trail Bits on the... So
yes.
They're a former client of ours from many years ago.
Yeah.
And so I'm familiar with them. And I saw their post about what the work that they did with RubyGems, and I'm like, oh, this is great. They're also the ones I think who created Bundler Audit originally. I think it might have came out of Trail Bits as well, which is another really useful tool in the community. But was that something that was like help partially funded type of thing? Or I don't know if you can disclose that sort of thing.
Yeah, so Alpha Omega funded the audit. So Alpha Omega is a foundation under the Linux Foundation. They're part of the OpenSSF, and they're funded. Their money comes from the large cloud providers, so Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and they're purely focused on improving security in open source. And so like they've worked with the Python Software Foundation, they worked with the Rust Foundation, they worked with a number of these sort of package repository groups. And so they started working with us. And so the first engagement they had with us was like, we would love to fund an audit of your systems to make sure you're secure. And we're like, yes, we would love that. That'd be great. And so, and they're very close with Trail Bits folks. And so that's how that came to be. And we also there's another part of that funding agreement was to build organizations in RubyGems. So in the past, a gem was owned by individual users. And there was like a very minimalistic permissions model of you're either an owner or you're not. And so that became a problem for companies like AWS, who has hundreds of gems. And they have a model where they have a team that oversees gem management, but individual teams at AWS that own the functionality that their specific gem works with actually are the ones making the changes. And so they had a lot of challenges around like, what if someone like yanks a gem? What if someone decides to delete something? And that means it's gone. So you go to do a bundle install and that gem is no longer there. That's going to be a problem. And so organizations that work both added a new role called the maintainer role, which is not as permissive as owners, but allows you to publish gems and all that. And as well as puts the ownership of gems into an organization that a company can own and run and manage permissions. And then, then you can sort of like figure out, so you have all your gems under one sort of user group that's managing that.
That makes sense. And that sounds like a good fail-safe thing as well. Or someone's no longer able to work on the project for whatever reason. And then I would imagine that would help with transitioning projects and stuff like that. And so, thanks for that. Just happened to read about, I think it was literally yesterday I read that article. So, and also I would imagine something like that by doing that. And so for those listening, like have never had an external team service come in and provide an audit or review of your code base or part of your infrastructure, did it safe to assume that you probably got a list of like recommendations and to-dos that your team can work on? And you're like, okay, we'll add this to the backlog, or these are things we should probably address really quickly, things you may not have even considered, or it's just get that fresh perspective. And you're like, great, this is helpful. And then we'll work on this in the near future or whatnot.
Absolutely. There definitely was. The good news, there was nothing major. So that was great validation to know that, okay, great, we're doing good things. There were some immediate things like, oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, and so as of course, they would give us the results as they came in. And so Samuel and I think also Colby on the team started to address the ones that are like, oh, that's easy to fix, and let's patch that up. That maybe it's an attack vector, it's probably unlikely, but it is an attack vector, so let's go ahead and address it. And so we did all that. That was like back in August and September when we started to get those results and started to address some things. But some stuff was longer term, and I think this is great for the topic of the podcast, which is a lot of the infrastructure like Terraform that we built is over 10 years old. right? And you kind of like maintain it and you get this drift where, okay, there's a better way of doing this, but what we have works. And you know what? We don't have a lot of extra time. So we're not going to go rewrite how we deploy our infrastructure right now. Or, maybe we keep adding groups to the IAM model and you're like, it's fine. But like, wait a minute, you mean so-and-so who's no longer involved has all this permission access to stuff? They're probably not going to do anything, but like, it shouldn't be that way. So I think there was a good list of like, right. Maybe we should do a refactor, if you will, or even a rebuild of how we do infrastructure that matches more of sort of the modern take of this, that is more secure, that maybe has good auditability. So like what happens if someone's account gets taken over? Like, do we know if they went and did a destructive action or compromised part of the infrastructure? Maybe not as well as we'd like. So it's stuff like that you put off or you don't think it's important, but then once you see it, you're like, oh yeah, maybe we should invest into that.
Can you tell me a little bit about the EU's Cyber Resilience Act? Is it CRA, I think it's called?
The CRA, yes. Lots of things I'm learning about since I've stepped into this role. The CRA is one of them. For those that aren't familiar with the CRA, which is fine, this is a new act that was passed by the European Parliament, and it essentially is addressing cybersecurity for any digital product that will be shipped to or sort of deployed to the EU. And so I think the easiest way to think about it from what I've learned so far is it's like SOC 2, but now all your open source dependencies are in scope. So you need to be aware of what they are and if there's any vulnerabilities in your dependency graph. And so the act won't be enforced until 2026. So we have basically a year and a half before the first provisions will be enforced. And I think it's just like vulnerability reporting. But this is going to change things. It's kind of like GDPR did for sort of like data privacy and all that. That's a similar deal, but now you're going to have to be aware of what software is shipping with your stack. And I think what I heard was one of the reasons this is so important is that there's a lot of cheap IoT devices that are being shipped all over that are actually fairly easily compromised and a security issue, that the EU is aware of. I think lots of people are aware of. And so this is just a way to sort of advance security and make things safer going forward. Now, I'm part of a working group through the Eclipse Foundation as part of my job. I'm part of this group that is putting together how should this act be sort of interpreted and enforced. So the good news is the European Commission is working with this group to sort of like make sure that the intent still happens. So like we improve security, but we don't make it too onerous. So there's a lot of questions around if you're an open source maintainer, what do you have to do? What are your obligations? And there's a thing called a manufacturer, which is the company or the entity shipping the software that's making money from it. And they have the primary obligations under the act to say, yes, here's our dependencies and here are the vulnerabilities and here's what we're doing about them. I mean, we'll see what that looks like exactly. But the Act also introduces this concept of an open source steward, and RubyGems and any package repository would be an open source steward. So there will be some obligations for us, but it's not at the same level that like manufacturers would have.
Interesting. Is there anything at the moment, is there something that you think people that I'm going to have to go do some research on this, but like for what you know about it, like if I have a open source project called Oh My Z Shell and it gets installed on a lot of people's computers, and do you know if they're like, I need to be thinking about this at all? Or
the sentiment is that no, probably not. There's actually a great blog post that came out from GitHub this week. Felix published it, and I can send you a link you can put in the show notes, that talks about sort of where the act is and how it's being interpreted and what this really means for like open source contributors and for some companies. There's still a lot to be determined. I don't think we'll know until probably maybe sometime next year how some of the more like gray areas will actually be enforced and what does that actually look like. But this blog post is really, I think, would answer your questions. And there's a lot of like, well, ultimately the courts will decide whether or not you should or should not have to do a certain thing under the act. But they're trying to make it so like that's clear enough and we're giving enough guidance to the industry on what they should do for the act, and that will actually play out in the courts too. So like, we did a thing, we thought that was good enough, and now you're saying it's not, now you're scrambling. Like, I think they want to avoid that. So we've got some time. So I'll send you that link, and you can share it with the audience.
We'll be right back with our interview with Marty in just a moment. Hey, it's me, Robbie. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you, yes, you, listeners, for making this possible. Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever people get their podcasts to help spread the word. Also, is there someone you think I should interview sometime on the podcast? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. And now let's get back to our interview with Marty Haught. So, thinking about open source and how it plays such a huge role in the industry, but maintaining these projects isn't always easy. I'm really curious about how you think about, because it sounds like you're not just working on like putting out fires and just addressing the issues of the day that the people are putting into wherever are using GitHub issues. I'm not sure where the public users of RubyGems or Bundler and tools like that are submitting their feature requests or highlighting bugs. But I find it hard to think like 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road when it comes to open source projects. I'm like, I didn't expect like my project to be used for more than a few years, let alone still be around 15 years, So it's kind of like, but the projects that you're working on, we need them to be around for a while. So, and I would imagine like that transition from relying on a bunch of volunteers, different organizations kind of getting involved. How do you kind of approach thinking about like long-term maintenance and sustainability of the project itself and kind of like, this is where we're going. You mentioned like you're adding organizations. Are there other types of things that your team is, how does that happen?
I think it is very natural and very easy for many of us to just focus on what's right, impacting us right now, the present, and maybe some immediate stuff, but maybe not think about what's the 1, 3, 5 year vision, where are we going? And so, part of my job is to start those conversations. It's not necessarily for me, Marty, to personally decide that, because it's like, I'm not the domain expert about all the things, but it is important for me to make sure that conversation happens, that we think about what are we going for? What are our values and our principles around what this team works on, what it cares about, what should we be doing? If we aren't doing that now, are we focusing on the wrong things? I think the team has been really cognizant of a lot of this. I think also in the volunteer nights and weekends mode, there's a lot like, whenever we could possibly do that, probably never. So they just keep deferring that and only do what's absolutely critical and being very scrappy that way. So now it's sort of like my role is, okay, what have we not been thinking about, or what should we talk about again that's important from a direction standpoint for the platform, for how we're servicing the community, how we're going to sustain this? So part of what I think about is what happens if people get burned out? What happens when certain critical people are ready to move on to something different? Who takes their place? Who has that expertise? Have we shared the knowledge? Could someone new come in and be productive? And the thing is, this is not the most trivial software. There's some deep complexity here. And if you get it wrong, it can have really grave implications. And so the good news is that the team is in pretty good place. We do have some new folks that have come in recently. I think we found a pretty good level of activity that's sustainable for the team. But I'm also like, okay, great. How do we bring in some new folks? How do I make sure there's plenty of money? Because sometimes money makes a big deal. It's like it changes everything if people feel like they just have to donate their time. And then there's all this requests, like there's these bugs and you feel bad, like, oh my goodness, there's a vulnerability. But like, this is my night. This is my weekend that I now have to patch this. And, like that can really wear someone down. And so like, how can I make sure, one, we fund the folks that are doing that work? And we do, but also give them the space and the permission to think about what are we not doing that we should do? And then how do we fund that? So we don't just say, now feel bad about this thing that you thought about that now you have to figure out how to implement, versus, okay, here's a plan. Here's how we're going to fund it. Here's how we're going to make this sustainable. And so I think these are all things that I'm asking the team to think about. I'm giving them space to think about that. And it's early days still, but I think we've got some interesting work for next year that's kind of come out some of those conversations. And there's also a piece here, which is like, dream big. Like, what if I was able to secure a few $1,000,000 and could grow the team to build something audacious? What would be like next level for this platform that you would never give yourself space to think about that, but maybe we should. And then let's see what we can do with it.
I think that having that dream big perspective with like, what's your moonshot, like what have you, and like, can we do these big hard things? And there's also like another part of me that's always kind of like feels nervous whenever I see projects starting to grow in their maturity level in a certain way, where I'm just like, because then there's got to be this interesting thing where you're not only needing to sustain the people that are working on it, they can keep a consistent sort of level of production, keep things stable in a very similar way. But then as your organization or project grows, new things come up for how you just run organizations and run a project and deal with all the dynamics that come up with that there's just like, where do you find that healthy balance of, it's not just a scrappy thing anymore. This is a thing that we're treating seriously, but also it's not so serious now that it's very difficult for us to feel like we're as efficient or as fast at doing things, because we've got a lot more things to consider now, because there's a lot more people. And so I don't know what the right answer to that is. It's always an interesting transitional period. And I'm like, are there models that you've seen that you hear work well and for other communities or other technology stacks, or that you're like, oh, they're doing a really good job of this? That's what we're kind of like, that's a good example for us to, but maybe this organization wants to do their own thing in their own flavor, but this, and we think we can do it better, but this group seems to be doing some pretty good things there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's think through a few of those things. So first of all, one thing that's been great about this role is that we are connected to other language ecosystems. So we talk to our friends at Rust or at Python or GitHub with NPM and talk shop. Like, what challenges are you seeing in terms of like security reporting? Like, there's been a rise of people just using Gen AI to submit what seems like a valid security report, but it's actually just BS. It's like, so now you're wasting someone's time trying to interpret this thing that was just generated and is not a real thing. So anyway.
Are those emails coming to people? Because I've gotten some.
Oh, yeah. We get them, a hacker one or something, different ways they can submit these reports. And we don't know, like, someone has to interpret that and say, wait a minute, is this nonsense? And is this really a vulnerability? How would you exploit this? So anyway, this is a good example of how the different language ecosystems are kind of talking to each other about like, hey, are you seeing this? Yeah, we're seeing that. So what's your approach? Oh, that's great. I love that. So we'll adopt that. So that's always great. It's great to talk to your peers, especially in different contexts, to see how they're approaching things. That's just great anyway. I would say that I've done this so much in my career over the years, and I would say, first of all, context matters, and it's different. So what worked for someone at one company or one situation doesn't mean it's going to work for you, and to just acknowledge that. But it's good to unpack, well, what's fundamentally going on in this situation? What's the issue? What are the pain points? How have different groups solved this? And how or why did it work for them? And so then also evaluate, okay, here's the team I have. Here's what they're capable of. Here's what they're comfortable with. Here's what I think is reasonable for us to try. When I think about teams and organizations, as long as we're learning, as long as we're growing and improving, that's what really matters. Where you start that's your set point. That's where you start from, and find what's the reasonable improvement to make. Make sure it actually improves something. Like, just don't bring like, hey, we're gonna use this new process, it's gonna be great, and then you find out it actually made things worse. It's like, okay, how do you know something is making your organization better, is helping your team, is making the product safer, more efficient, whatever it might be? Like, make sure that you are confident that's the case. And then like trying to change too much, like little steps at a time, make sure the improvement sticks and then move on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's at least kind of how I think about it.
No, I think that touches on a number of things. I know that I have a tendency to add a lot of follow-up questions to a question. That's just the way my brain works, I guess. Thanks for entertaining me, Marty, on that. I think about the community's role as well. And so is it that if there's people right now that are listening that are part of the Ruby community, let's say, and they want to find a way to contribute, but maybe would you have, like, what would be the most ideal thing that you would tell people? Like, hey, if you work at an organization that has a lot of people using Ruby on a regular basis, like, how is your organization participating in this? Or what can you do individually? What sort of levers or pitches could you offer them on like, hey, send some money our way or send time here?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things I would say. The first is if you're a company, and this is something that a new program we rolled out, which is the corporate sponsors program. Some backstory real quick is that for the longest time, Ruby Central made money at conferences, and we're a nonprofit. So that money paid for the infrastructure. It formed grants that went out to the community to improve things. And that was great. And we didn't care about fundraising. We didn't care about having membership programs and all that until the pandemic, when that changed. We stopped making money at conferences, and now all of a sudden we're like, all our eggs in the conference revenue basket, that's bad. So this is a very normal thing that nonprofits do. And so this corporate sponsors program is a way to allow companies that care about Ruby and its ecosystem to contribute, join, and give different levels of money that they're comfortable with. And we have, I think, like 10 current members of the program. We just started just this fall, so it's brand new. But we'd love to grow that to, 30, 50, 100 companies eventually. And my thinking is there's a level for every company, whether it's like $5,000 a year, or maybe it's 50 or 100 or whatever. There's a level that I think every company could find works for them that allows us to make the funding sustainable for open source. So that's one thing that I would say any of your audience members, if you're at a company you think would want to contribute and make sure this is sustainable and is well taken care of, that's the avenue. The next avenue is sort of if you have extra development time. So maybe you want to, and this is, we see this a fair amount where large Ruby companies will have a team or a few individuals that are working purely on open source because that's important. They recognize and they invest that way. And that's like Shopify or GitHub, Gusto, these types of companies have been doing this, and it's great. And so if you have a team or individuals at a company like that would like to get involved, reach out to us. We have on Ruby Central's page, there is now an open source program page. And that kind of talks about the whole program. That was one of the things I did first. Like, okay, we need a page where people can just learn about what we're doing and how to engage and understand what we care about and where we're going with things. And so that's the purpose of that page. And there's a get involved section. So there's a bundler Slack. You can join and you can talk to us. And that's where many people join and say, hey, I noticed this thing in Bundler. How do you do this thing in RubyGems or whatever? And so that's a great place where you can interact with the team. There is also, you can go to our repo. There's a getting started guide for RubyGems, and you can like, hey, here's our issues. And if you want to submit a PR to fix something, great. And we'll happily guide you along. So I think those are all the most obvious ways. And I think the last thing I would say is at the different Ruby Central events, we now have a thing called Hack Days, where there's a portion of the conference where open source teams get together and people can just show up and learn and like, hey, can I hack on a thing? Yes, you can. Let's pair on this right together. And so I would say at the next Ruby Central event, come and see us at the Hack Day event, and we'll happily get you involved.
Wonderful. I'll definitely include links, as many of those links as I can track down for everybody in the show notes as well. So you can kind of nudge your, maybe you are the manager of your department, or maybe you could drop a subtle hint that get some sponsorship money into the organization. That would be very helpful. I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk about team processes, which can often make or break a project. And so I get that in the context of maybe open source, and but you mentioned that it's the importance of trying to find the right balance between process and flexibility is key for teams. So how do you approach setting up processes that provide enough, say, structure without, say, stifling creativity or agility?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it all depends. So first of all, the one thing to know about this team is it's distributed around the world, completely asynchronous. There is no getting everyone together. I mean, because we have people in all different time zones around the world, so there's always someone sleeping on the team. And so that presents a challenge in terms of doing anything synchronous. And so the team already has adopted an asynchronous way of working together. And so knowing, in my mind, I want to always be able to answer a few questions. What is the team working on? What should we work on next? How does new work come in? So whether that's issues, whether that's new feature requests or whatever, how does that come in? What's the process for us to evaluate that and determine, is this something we do now? Is this something we do later? Is this something we say doesn't make sense? So I would want to see some process around that, because that's fundamental. You need to know how work comes in and sort of gets prioritized and then gets assigned and gets tracked. We use GitHub projects for our work. We use GitHub issues a lot. So the team is basically fully on the GitHub stack. And so that's how the team works. I think there is a little bit of a challenge in that. How do you roll up individual tasks and issues into something broader, into themes, into projects, into milestones that make sense? And so I think, especially in this kind of team where everyone knows their part of the stack or their library they're overseeing. And so we trust them to make the decisions about what should be worked on now or later or isn't an issue, right? And so they are empowered, they are empowered to sort of make those decisions. And so then the challenge comes, how do you communicate that? How do they tell me and how I can describe to a broader audience, what does the next few months look like? What are we trying to get done? What is something we can take on based on our current budget and how much time is being invested versus stuff that we can't do? And so I think that's one area where we're working through that, trying to figure out like, how do we talk about the larger things and then plan that out over a longer time horizon. I think the other one is, how do you coordinate work that is being done in terms of like, hey, I'm going to pick up this thing and I'm going to do it. And here's my plans. Here's an RFC of what I'm thinking about the solution. And so that usually happens in Slack. But like, I think with all these things, and I've been at different companies. I was at HashiCorp before this. I was at Fastly before that. I had my own consultancy for a while. And I've worked with client teams. And so I've seen lots of different models. So I think it kind of depends on the tools you have and how heavy of a process or how much rigor do you really need. And I think as long as you can answer the basic questions, you're fine. But sometimes, depending on the size, you'll need more structure and more predictability. And so I prefer to see the right size of process and structure, but you definitely have to have some. If you don't have any, then it's like, I don't even know what's happening. And then you just have to go talk to people to understand things. And that's not great.
Aside from just that, if things are feeling a little off, are there other signs that a team's process might need some adjusting?
Well, yeah. So one, how much do they communicate? The communication patterns are a great first sort of like sign of health or unhealth, really, with a team and how it functions. So that's the first, like when I walk into a new situation, I want to see, what does communication look like? And is there agreement? How do we work through dissent? Do people actively debate in a healthy way? What does that model look like? Or do they just not? And then it's like, are we okay here? Like, is someone like resenting somebody else's activity? This is all like, that's all about like trust. So communication usually is a really great sign about the level of trust in a team and how much they want to work together. And so I think an important part for any leader that comes in is to assess where things are, where they stand, and then also set the expectations. Here's what I'd like to see. Not so much like, I'm going to tell you all how to do this, because, you could do that, but we're all adults here, generally speaking, right? You all have your experts in certain ways. You have your experience. You probably have already found a way to work. And so I want to find the way that makes sense for everyone and give folks the space to express that, but make it clear. What are we shooting for? What are we going for? What is good enough? What are the standards? And then let the team work that out. So I think if you don't set those expectations, then people are going to just do whatever they want to do and it won't be cohesive.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. I want to take a moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Think of us as a robot repair shop for your software projects. Beep bop, beep bop, fixing up legacy applications, tuning their gears, and upgrading their performance. Got a bot that's a bit rusty? We offer staff augmentation to help tighten the bolts. Need a complete overhaul? Our fractional development services are like installing a new state-of-the-art processor without breaking the bank. We specialize in technologies like Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel. So if you know of a company whose software is moving like a clunky automation, slowed down by technical debt or outdated features, send them our way. We'll turn it into a sleek, efficient machine ready to take on the future. Visit us at planetargon.com. That's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. And remember, well-maintained software runs like clockwork. Beep, bop, beep, beep, bop, beep, beep. Is that what robots sound like? I don't know. Let's get back to the show. Appreciate you kind of digging into that for us. I think that's very applicable regardless of that being a open source type of project like what you're working with, and just in any organization within a team, like those dynamics. And so transition a little bit more on the maybe a related question. I always try to get some advice from our guests for our listeners. So let's imagine that there's some people out there listening right now, and maybe they feel like there's some inefficiencies with how their team's communicating about maybe technical debt or the direction of how the software project is going. But maybe they don't feel like they're in a position to really have a lot of influence. At least that's what they feel, because maybe they've advocated for like, hey, I feel like we should address these issues. It would make our lives easier, but they heard not right now, maybe a few times. And so they've started to interpret that as never, maybe in their mind. So they stop asking or stop pitching it. What advice would you offer them on how to maybe reapproach that sort of situation?
Yeah, I think it's a very common problem. And I think the first thing is to get clear about what you're seeing and get clear about the impact. Like, I think this is probably advice that we either forget or it's good to be reminded of, that it's very important to think about the impact of what you're doing or not doing and being able to express that. So oftentimes, if you go to one of your leaders and you say, the code is crufty and I want to make it really nice and improve it, and can I have like 3 months to do that? And they're going to most likely say, what? 3 months to just make it nice? Right? Like, that's the wrong way to sell it, because ultimately you're not really talking about the problem and the impact it has. Like, the state of this code, the way these systems are put together, it's very difficult to make changes. It's very difficult to maintain and address bugs because of these characteristics of the software. And so you, as an engineer who understands that, can articulate that, you can go to your leader and say, here's what I'm seeing. The state of the code or whatever, this design is causing these issues. And here's how that translates to our work. We now lose 10%, or we spend half a day every time we do a release with this activity, that if we made this change, that would go away. That would improve things. So I think the first piece is to be able to describe the impact and how addressing it will make things better. The next piece is if you get pushback, like a not yet, or maybe like you interpret that as they don't care, I would ask about that. Like, tell me about what leadership values that I can understand why this is not being prioritized. I want to understand more of that, because then maybe in that answer, you could realize there's politics involved and that's maybe not going to be able to be fixed perhaps, or you understand what they care about more and they're like, I see. You value this thing over here, not this thing that I am sort of pitching the improvement around. So now I understand this matters to you. So now I can think about how can I reframe this issue I'm seeing, this problem, in a way that you now value. Basically help your boss sell it. Help your boss convince others that this is worth doing. And also recognize that maybe just take baby steps with it. If you ask for I want to rewrite the whole thing over 3 months versus I would like to improve this one API endpoint and add this pattern or whatever it is, and that'll take me 2 days, and here's how I'm going to measure that it got better, that's way easier to sell that than I want to take 3 months out of doing productive work to fix a thing that I see as an issue.
That's some wonderful advice. I really, I try to ask similar types of questions with a lot of guests and get different perspectives. And something you were saying there, I feel like just calling that out around asking that follow-up question to the person being like, hey, why not? Like, what's your rationale for that? Or where are your values on, and so you can better understand that you can maybe, as you said, go back and reframe it again, but then just digging a little deeper in that moment could be something they can be doing right now. But like, well, you asked for that upgrade or dealing with that, you want to refactor that certain part of your application, switch a gem to something new because that other one is going to not be around anymore or supported. So how can you frame that in a different way? Just like go reapproach that now. You can go ask them. I'm speaking to the audience here. Just go ask them for more details or something and just try to dig into it a little bit more, but be curious about it and not from I'm doing this to convince you and I will win you over at some point. It's like kind of have to get the stars aligned a little bit there.
There's one more thing I would say too, which is you should talk to your peers. You should talk to people on other teams and share with them privately, hey, I see this issue. I've been thinking about this. Can you give me any feedback on this solution or how I should convince leadership this is important? And basically workshop it with other people around the organization. Because if it's just you that says, hey, I see this thing, I think we could do this, that might not be enough. But all of a sudden, if like, oh, there are all these other engineers and maybe some other engineering leaders that like I've all talked and here's kind of where we land on something, all of a sudden now that would have a little more weight to it than like just you personally doing that.
And then you can form a union and just demand it.
Well, right.
Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. Depends on your situation.
There can always be a little bit of politicking there, I suppose. But couple of final questions for you. I like to ask people, is there a non-programming, non-technical, non-software industry book that you like to recommend to your peers?
Yes, definitely. I'm not a big reader, but I have read a good number of books. I think the one I've read recently that got me thinking more broadly about things is a book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. And I'm later in my career, as you probably can tell, starting in the 90s, right? I'm on the second half of my career, if you will. And a lot of what I think about is, how do I help others? How do I give back? And I want to have impact. I want to help others. And so like, how should I go about doing that? I think Give and Take gets into some of that. And also what's interesting about what that book covers is how you interact with others in this way where you're more of a giver is going to be positive for you, and how to protect yourself from being taken advantage of if you're too generous. So there's a bunch of very interesting, tangible things that Adam covers in the book that I wish I'd have read it long ago, honestly. It would have been great. I mean, maybe intuitively I landed on a few of them, but like that you don't have to be a taker and get ahead and win no matter what. That you can still win, if you will, by being generous and by giving things away. And that book goes into a lot of detail around that. So I think that's a really interesting book that's non-technical.
Nice. I'll include links to that in the show notes and grab a copy of that myself. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software development and online?
I'm on Blue Sky, and I think LinkedIn are the two places that are probably best to follow sort of anything I'm talking about publicly. I have intentions to relaunch a blog long ago. We'll see if I do that, but I do share my thoughts on Blue Sky and LinkedIn here and there, and so like that's what I'd recommend.
I'll definitely include links to all that in the show notes for everybody. And with that, it's been such a delight to have you join us on Maintainable, Marty. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you, Robbie. It's been a pleasure.
Maintainable.